definitely not a stalemate in the air. It's a very, very dynamic battle. On the Russian side, we've got large numbers of Russian drones and lots of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles being used night after night against Ukraine, with the Ukrainian air defences taking down many drones. But as the number of drones increased, the numbers that get through increase. And Ukraine's making every effort it can to strike deep into Russia, not just military targets like logistics and command and control and radar, but also industrial targets such as the factories that are making drones.
We keep hearing in the commentary, and this is where I personally think a lot of the commentary around Ukraine gets it wrong, because people are trying to analyse who is winning in the conflict by looking at how far the front line moves and who is advancing further, but failing to take into account what's going on at the operational level and what's going on at the strategic level. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Russia seems to be pressing on with its very attritional First World War style assaults, supported by a lot of drones. And it's trying to push the Ukrainians back in the Donbass, which seems to be the main effort, but also sustaining pressure on Ukraine's northern border. But look, this isn't just a land war. There's an important aerospace dimension to this. And both sides have been striking at each other, and both sides have increased the amount of striking they've been doing. Russia has recently exploited the fact that it's built 2 factories to produce these Shahed drones, with extensive drone and missile attacks designed to keep the ordinary decent people of Ukraine awake, to attack Ukrainian command and control and defense industry. But Ukraine's doing the same. It's developed increasingly capable deep strike capabilities, mainly drones, but also missile, including this large cruise missile they recently unveiled. And that too is attacking Russian command and control, radar, air defense systems, and it's attacking Russian defense industry. However, there is an important factor that bears on all of this, which is manpower, in that Russia seems to have the ability, using large salaries and enlistment bonuses, to keep recruiting people to feed its army, whereas Ukraine is a smaller country. It's also using conscription, but its conscription is very limited. It isn't conscripting people under 25 for reasons which it's explained. So there's going to be a key point. Will Ukraine run out of manpower at some stage? I don't know. And will Ukraine gain an edge in this deep battle that both sides are fighting each other? There's also the question about whether Ukraine's friends are going to beef up Ukrainian air and missile defences quickly enough to reduce the impact of these massive Russian strikes.
So, Ben, there's been a lot of discussion about a potential stalemate in the conflict. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you see opportunities for either side to gain a decisive advantage in the coming months, or to at least gain the initiative? Or how do you see the conflict developing?
Well, it's not a stalemate at sea. The Ukraine gained decisive advantages there over Russia, which it's continued to sustain. And of course, we have civilian shipping and grain ships flowing in a relatively unimpeded fashion up the western side of the Black Sea, while the Russian Navy is confined to the eastern side of the Black Sea. It is a stalemate on land, but Russia is pushing through very, very slowly. And I agree with the MOD's assessment that absent a breakthrough on land, to conquer the rest of the Donbass might take Ukraine over 4 more years and incur at least another million casualties. And it's definitely not a stalemate in the air. It's a very, very dynamic battle. On the Russian side, we've got large numbers of Russian drones and lots of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles being used night after night against Ukraine, with the Ukrainian air defences taking down many drones. But as the number of drones increased, the numbers that get through increase. And Ukraine's making every effort it can to strike deep into Russia, not just military targets like logistics and command and control and radar, but also industrial targets such as the factories that are making drones. So I don't think it's a stalemate. It's a stalemate. It may look very much like the First World War in 1916 and 17 on the land. But remember, even in 1916 and 17, there was slow movement with attacks on both sides. And it's definitely not a stalemate in the land or the air.
So Ben, you've written extensively on the lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you think the Ukrainians have looked at those and are applying them inside Ukraine? And do you think that the West is taking the lessons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine and properly applying them into the development of its military capability for the future? And in particular, the UK. Have those lessons been brought into the strategic defence review? Are you confident that we're going to be ready for what the future shows? Or do you think we're going to relearn those lessons again at some stage in the future?
We shouldn't forget that at times in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US, the UK, and their allies engaged in very heavy fighting, up to sort of battle group attacks. And the only reason they didn't sustain as many casualties as the Ukrainian and Russian armies is because they had very well protected armored vehicles and invested heavily in protection of individual soldiers, and also put a lot of resources into casualty evacuation, mainly by helicopter. But of course, that was a very benevolent environment in that the West had electromagnetic dominance and also could move battlefield helicopters around as much as it wanted. And those don't apply in Ukraine. I mean, I do see a lot of evidence that NATO, that the US and the UK are attempting to learn from the experience of the Ukrainian army. And we see that, for example, in the US concept of multi-domain integration, and in the British Army's future land operating concept and its emphasis on reconnaissance strike and deep attack. But of course, the war is still in progress, and we don't know how it's going to turn out over the next few weeks, let alone succeeding months and years. And again, we do have to be very careful about all this commentary on Ukraine that is actually thinly disguised advocacy. But look, there's an important strategic lessons here, which I'm not sure have sunk in. The lesson from Afghanistan is that the West failed. And what I don't see in the UK, the US, or in NATO is any significant effort since 2001 to understand why they failed and learn the lesson. And if you take the UK as an example, the House of Commons Defence Committee recommended that there was an inquiry about the Afghanistan war, using the same sort of approach and importance as the Iraq inquiry. That was given a stiff ignoring by the Conservative government, and the Labour Party didn't push for it either. Now, the cynic would say that's because both parties would have something to lose reputationally by an Afghanistan inquiry, exposing their inadequate leadership and resourcing of the armed forces for the war in Afghanistan, particularly the early parts. The other key lesson, which does seem to be addressed in part, is that there wouldn't have been a war in Ukraine if deterrence had worked. If the West had convinced Putin that it was serious about supporting Ukraine, had convinced him that they had credible intelligence and proof that Russia was preparing to attack, and had convinced him that the cost of continuing to attack Ukraine would be a cost that Russia as a country couldn't bear. And of course, that relates to the war at the moment, because one way in which the war might be ended were if Putin and his inner circle became convinced that the cost was greater than they could bear. But we haven't seen that happen yet. And I don't think there's been enough analysis about the failure in deterrence of Ukraine and what that means for future deterrence by the US, the UK, and NATO.
Well, Ben, on all of those points, I have to agree with you wholeheartedly. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.